All right, so we're diving into some potentially, let's say, controversial aspects of Bitcoin today.
Sounds intriguing.
This paper, The Distributional Consequences of Bitcoin, really doesn't hold back. How so? It's not just about, hey, is Bitcoin a good investment? It's more like, what if Bitcoin's success actually hurts more people than it helps? Heavy stuff.
That is a pretty bold claim. I'm interested to see how they back that up.
They basically come right out and call Bitcoin, are you ready for this, a zero-sum game.
Okay, I've heard that one before. What's their reasoning this time?
Their argument is that every Bitcoin winner equals a Bitcoin loser. Even if, and this is key, even if the price keeps going up. So like fundamentally flawed from the get-go. Or is there something to that, even in a, to the moon scenario?
You've hit on a key point that I think they miss. The paper jumps right into this whole redistributive narrative, but their understanding of how Bitcoin even came about, its origins, feels a little off, honestly.
They spend a good chunk of the paper, like dissecting Satoshi's original white paper, right?
Yeah, and they kind of get stuck on this idea that Satoshi, Bitcoin's creator, fundamentally misunderstood how online payments work. It's like this weird straw man argument they keep coming back to.
So what's the disconnect? What are they missing in that white paper?
They nitpick these points about needing trustless systems for online commerce, saying that, current systems already do that.
Which, I mean, to be fair, they kind of do, right?
But Bitcoin's innovation wasn't just about cutting out the middleman. It was about decentralization, about making a system resistant to censorship and manipulation. That's a whole different ballgame that I think they're just completely glossing over.
So they're focused on the trees, missing the forest situation.
Exactly. They're so busy trying to analyze Bitcoin through the lens of the existing financial system that they completely miss the bigger picture that Bitcoin represents, a potential paradigm shift.
But even if their take on Bitcoin's origins is flawed, isn't their core argument still kind of valid? Like if the price just keeps skyrocketing without any real-world value being created, someone's got to be losing out, right?
We need to unpack their assumption of no real-world value because that's where a lot of this falls apart. They lean really heavily on this lack of traditional income streams, dividends, interest, as if those are the only metrics for value.
It's very 20th century thinking.
Right.
Like saying the internet had no value in the 90s just because it wasn't making traditional profits yet.
Exactly. And that narrow view completely ignores all the ways people actually use Bitcoin. We're talking remittances in developing countries, a hedge against inflation in unstable economies, online microtransactions that traditional systems just can't handle. There's real utility there that they're not even considering.
So they miss the mark by just focusing on Bitcoin as an investment and completely skip over its practical applications.
Right. That whole zero-sum game analogy starts to crumble when you factor in those broader applications where Bitcoin is providing a tangible service, creating actual value.
It becomes less about one person gaining at another's expense and more about how this tech changes our whole relationship with money,
Absolutely. And they miss that again. Their focus on debunking Bitcoin as a payment system overshadows its potential to disrupt traditional finance, which is a much bigger deal.
It's like they're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, judging Bitcoin by the standards of the very system it's trying to, upend.
100%.
But even if we acknowledge that, their analysis of Bitcoin's utility is flawed, don't they raise some valid concerns about wealth inequality, potential social unrest, if Bitcoin does go to the moon?
That's where things get really interesting. They basically say that if Bitcoin's price goes up without a corresponding increase in productivity, then it's just going to lead to a massive wealth transfer.
From the latecomers to the early adopters.
Exactly.
Which on the surface, kind of makes sense, right? Like a game of musical chairs where the early birds get the seats.
Mm-hmm.
What's the flaw in that analogy?
Well, for one, they present it as a guaranteed outcome. They completely overlook how dynamic both the Bitcoin market and the economy as a whole actually are.
Okay, so what are they missing?
Their model, assumes this static world where Bitcoin is the only thing increasing in value.
So it's like saying if the price of gold goes up, everyone who didn't buy gold is now inherently poorer.
Exactly. It just doesn't work that way. People are constantly shifting their investments, right? Stocks, bonds, real estate, and Bitcoin too. It's not this one-way street they're making it out to be.
Meaning, just because someone bought Bitcoin early doesn't mean they're sitting on a dragon's hoard of digital gold forever, right? What happens when those early adopters decide to cash out?
That's another thing they miss. As Bitcoin's price rises, some of those early adopters are going to sell. It's inevitable. And those gains, They often flow right back into the economy, potentially funding new businesses, creating jobs, even stimulating overall economic growth.
So even those who never touched Bitcoin could benefit from that ripple effect.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about their claim that Bitcoin doesn't actually boost productivity?
Again, they're so focused on these traditional metrics, like GDP, that they completely ignore Bitcoin's potential to unlock entirely new forms of economic activity. It's like they're looking through a pinhole.
Okay, give me an example. What kind of new forms are we talking about here?
Think about the Lightning Network.
Okay.
Imagine a system built on top of Bitcoin that allows for, like, near instant, incredibly cheap transactions. This could completely revolutionize online micropayments. We could see entirely new business models, new revenue streams, stuff that just wouldn't be possible with our current systems.
Okay, for those of us who are not like tech wizards, break down the Lightning Network a little bit more. Why should we care?
Think about it this way. You want to read an article online, right? But it costs a few cents.
Right.
Right now, our traditional systems are just too slow and too expensive to make those kinds of microtransactions practical.
It's true.
But the Lightning Network, it allows for those tiny payments to happen seamlessly. Suddenly, you have all these new ways for creators to get paid, new ways to access information, new ways to do business, all because of this tech.
So Bitcoin's underlying tech itself could be a productivity booster, even if it's not showing up in the ways we're traditionally measuring it.
Exactly. It's like saying electricity didn't actually increase productivity just because we didn't have good ways to measure its impact at the time.
That's a great analogy.
We're still so early in this whole Bitcoin experiment. We're just starting to understand how it can transform things. To just dismiss its potential entirely is, I think, a huge mistake.
The authors seem very stuck on this idea of a fixed pie. That if Bitcoin's value is going up, it's just this linear, one-way flow of wealth.
Right, and that's why I think their warnings about social unrest feel kind of alarmist. They paint this picture of, like, Bitcoin billionaires lording over an impoverished majority.
Which seems a little extreme.
They're neglecting the potential for governments to actually adapt and respond to these shifts in wealth distribution. Like, this isn't some brand new problem.
Right, governments have been dealing with wealth inequality forever.
Exactly. And they already have tools to address it.
Right.
Like taxation, social programs. It's not like they're just going to be helpless bystanders in a Bitcoin-dominated world.
It's weird. They completely gloss over that, like governments are just powerless against this.
And they also forget, conveniently, I think, that Bitcoin's whole decentralized nature makes it incredibly difficult for any single entity, even a government, to actually control or manipulate it.
It's not like they can just shut it down, right?
Exactly. Even if one country bans or restricts Bitcoin, it can just flourish somewhere else. They call it regulatory arbitrage.
Okay, again, for those of us who don't speak fluent economics, what is regulatory arbitrage?
Basically, it means something benefits from the difference in regulations between different places. So one country cracks down on Bitcoin. Businesses and users might just move to a country with a more favorable regulatory environment. It's like squeezing a balloon.
The air doesn't disappear, it just goes somewhere else.
Exactly.
So not exactly the doomsday scenario they're painting, huh?
Right. This whole idea that governments are powerless against some kind of, like, Bitcoin-fueled social collapse is, to put it mildly, a stretch. It's so much more complex and nuanced than they're presenting it.
They seem very set on this, like, binary view of Bitcoin. It's either this bubble that's going to burst, or it's this runaway train of wealth concentration. There's no in-between.
Exactly. They miss that it's probably a bit of both, with a whole lot of unpredictable stuff happening in between. Like, it's like trying to predict the weather 10 years from now. You can make educated guesses, but who knows?
It's impossible. And this kind of leads into their claims about Bitcoin's influence on politics. They really hone in on the U.S. elections, right?
Yeah. They basically paint this picture of the U.S. election as this, like, campaign spending free-for-all. Like, Bitcoin millionaires are just going to bankroll candidates to push some pro-Bitcoin agenda.
Which, I mean, again, possible, I guess, but is that realistic?
They totally skip over the fact that most voters, most politicians even, don't really get Bitcoin yet.
It's not like there's this, like, massive voting block out there, single issue voting on Bitcoin deregulation.
Right. It's just not. The reality is most politicians are still trying to figure out what Bitcoin even is, let alone how to regulate it. So to say that it's already this puppet master controlling elections, come on, that's a bit much.
Feels like they're, like, cherry-picking data to fit this narrative, you know? Like they already decided Bitcoin is bad and just found stuff to back that up.
Yeah, I see that. Their analysis lacks the nuance, the critical thinking that a topic as complex and as, let's be honest, fast-moving as Bitcoin really needs. It's easy to get caught up in the fear-mongering.
Which is exactly why we're doing this. It's all about looking at these arguments, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, playing devil's advocate here, are they really saying that missing out on Bitcoin isn't just missing a chance to get rich? It's potentially making you poorer than you would have been if it never existed.
It is a bold statement, I'll give them that. But it's built on, like, really shaky assumptions, and frankly, a very limited understanding of Bitcoin and how economics actually work.
This idea of wealth as this fixed pie again.
Exactly. It's not static. It can grow. It can change.
So for our listener who's thinking, okay, what do I do with all of this? What would you say?
It's tempting to either go all in on Bitcoin or just write it off completely based on one thing you read, right? But the reality is we're still so early in this experiment. The best thing anyone can do is stay informed, stay engaged, be critical, and don't make decisions out of fear or hype. This isn't just about Bitcoin. This is about the future of how we think about money, and we're all part of figuring that out.